Hello everybody, so in this video I'm going to be attempting to clone this beer, which is a Shipyard Rye Pale Ale. Now, there aren't really any widely available clone recipes for this that I've been able to find, so this video is going to be all about how I've actually come up with the clone recipe for this beer, and hopefully whether or not it turns out anything like the original. So yeah, let's start talking about cloning a beer. Okay, so first off, I've talked about this a couple of times in other videos about clone beers. The first thing that I think you really need to kind of have in your mind when you are trying to do clone beers is that the likelihood of you getting a 100%, clone carbon copy of an original beer, doing it on a homebrew system, is really, really unlikely. You might get close, you might have something that's very good, you might make something that's even better than the original beer, but don't set yourself up expecting to totally recreate the original, because in my experience that kind of just sets you up for failure a little bit, because it's really difficult. Even if you have the recipe 100% accurate, you know the details of the process and all of that, trying to recreate exactly the same outcome on different equipment, different circumstances, in a different location, with all the other factors that come into that, makes it really difficult. So I always tend to think, although I'm using the term clone in this video and the other ones, I always tend to think of it more as trying to create a tribute to a beer that you like, rather than trying to clone it, because you're kind of setting yourself up for a little bit of disappointment, in my opinion. Anyway, that aside, I do like doing the clone beers from time to time. It's a nice sort of interesting kind of exercise to see how close you can get to it, and especially in this case where maybe there isn't an available recipe, it's a little bit of a challenge to try and work out exactly what should go into it. So how to start going about cloning beer? Well, first of all, if you don't have to reinvent the wheel, don't do it. So look for existing recipes first of all. There's lots of books out there that have got recipes in. There's books that are entirely dedicated to clone recipes. So for example, if you're looking at kind of UK beers or ales, this is probably one of the original and best books for finding traditional English ales and so on. My one gripe with this book really is that there's no information given about yeast and stuff, and one thing I would say when you're trying to recreate beers similar to a commercial one, if you don't know what the yeast is, or you don't have a yeast that is quite close to what's being used for the original, that's gonna really throw it off in quite a lot of cases. If you want something a little bit more up to date, then there's another camera one there with recipes from people like Verdant and so on. I'm going to have a go at the pulp recipe out of this at some point and hopefully do a video on that. If you want American beers, Brew Your Own Big Book of Clone Recipes is a pretty good starting point. So it's got 300 recipes in there. I've done a couple of those, and again, in a lot of cases I don't actually know what the original beer is like, but they're still really good recipes to look at. So well worth getting, even if you don't necessarily know the beers that are in those books. So yeah, books, magazines. Also, if you go online, there's lots of recipes floating around on forums, recipe databases as well for some of the software. So for example, Beersmith has their online recipe database, Brewer's Friend as well. I'm sure some of the newer ones will also be doing similar things too. But you can go on there, and a lot of them are rated as well, so you can see there might be lots of different recipes for a particular beer. They'll often have been rated where other people have tried them out, so you can see the ones which are maybe working better than others and find them that way. So there's a few quite popular ones on the Beersmith database that I know about, like the Zombie Dust clone. I think a lot of people have taken the recipe off of that and made really good beers with it. So yeah, have a look for recipes that have been tried and tested first. Take a little bit of the work out of it for yourself. It's still going to be a big challenge even if you've got the recipe already. So yeah, like I said at the start though, this particular beer, there wasn't really much in the way of existing recipes out there. Now I did manage to find some information on a forum, one of the UK forums, which had a few clues which somebody had supposedly managed to get from the brewers themselves. So apparently they got a bit of information in terms of the numbers for the beer and ingredients and stuff. Some of it which looked pretty good, some of it I wasn't totally sure about, but that was a good starting point for me. But there wasn't any kind of quantities or anything like that. So you'll have to start looking for clues if there aren't recipes already out there. One thing you might want to start with is just looking at the actual, if it's a bottled beer or in a can, look at the labels on it itself. So straight away on the front of this one, obviously the main one is it's got to have some rye in it for a start, but you've also got hopping information on there. So dry hopped with Amarillo and Citra, and obviously the basic information like the ABV and stuff will give you an idea about gravities and so on. So this also has a bit more information on the back in terms of the grist. So rye crystal malt, so specifically crystal rye rather than just rye malt in this. And what else does it talk about? It does also mention, as well as the Amarillo and Citra on the front, that there's also Cascade and Summit in there. So as those are stated as dry hops on the front, it would be safe to assume, I would guess, that the Cascade and Summit are maybe used in the boil. Probably the Summit as a bittering hop, maybe the Cascade is in the middle or late hopping as well, maybe with some of the Citra and Amarillo too. So already we're starting to maybe pull apart a little bit of a recipe from that. Other places you might want to look on the website for the brewery as well. They'll often put a similar sort of information that you'll find on the bottle, but there might be more detail to it. You may find stuff on reviews as well. So in the past I found they're quite useful. So people reviewing beers may have done a bit of research themselves or spoken to the brewery and get more detailed information on there. And again, like I was saying before, going back to the forums, you may find that there's threads where people are trying to do the same thing as you and attempting to clone a beer, and you can start to gather some information from those. That sounds like quite a lot of fairly heavy research and so on, but probably the best or most fun thing you can do is actually evaluate the beer itself. So let's pop this one open and have a little taste test and see what that reveals for us. So I have drunk this beer quite a few times, mostly in Wetherspoons actually, because it's one of the beers that they have on in bottles. Final season's coming out this weekend, so it had to be the House Stark glassware. Pretty excited about watching that. Now, the first thing, especially when I first tried this beer, that I noticed straight away was the colour on it, because it's marketed as a pale ale, but as far as I'm concerned, that is no pale ale. It's definitely amber, and a pretty dark amber at that. So yeah, even for like an American amber, I would say that's kind of towards the the darker end of the scale, maybe in terms of colour. I would certainly, if I was selling that beer, maybe describe it as an amber or even a red ale perhaps. So colour-wise, yeah, and I said, like I said, I got some numbers from this forum thread about this beer that had some suggested numbers for the colour, but I would put that at the top end of the scale in terms of colour for an American amber or something like that, when I was trying to figure out the grist. So yeah, let's give it a little sniff. So there is a nice hoppy aroma on it. I wouldn't necessarily say there's big tropical notes off of there. It's more citrus for me, but there's maybe a little bit of a sort of soft stone fruit there as well. Quite pleasant, definitely nice and fruity, and there's a bit of the a kind of sweet toffee-like aroma, almost like a kind of toffee apple smell coming off the top there too. So let's have a taster. So the flavour's got a nice kind of orangey citrus kind of tang to it initially, and then there's this spicy rye flavour that comes through. I do like rye beers. I know it's an acquired taste. You can tell that it's mainly crystal rye, giving you that flavour as well, because it's got this kind of slightly burnt toffee, almost licorice taste to it as well, which I really like. Although I know, again, rye is an acquired taste, and crystal rye as well is even more of an acquired taste for some people. I know some people really don't get on with it at all, but I like it. And for me, it kind of gives you that nice, like I said, slightly sort of dark toffee taste, but it's not quite as sweet and maybe cloying as normal caramel malts can be. So it still gives you quite a dry beer, especially with that flavour from the rye as well. Let's have a look at the recipe, and I'll talk through how I got to the sort of numbers that I've put into that, and the general composition of you know, the ingredients and everything, and how I think that will give me something like this, hopefully. So, using the information that I got from the forum post that I mentioned previously, and what I'd also gathered from the bottle information and stuff on their website and so on, I got the set of numbers to start from in terms of what I thought would be the gravity, IBUs, rough colour, etc., and then basically worked back from there when I was figuring out the grist, and just used my own kind of interpretation of the beer to estimate the kind of hopping rates that you'd need and so on. So I went with 1046 original gravity to give 4.3% ABV using the Ringwood ale yeast. Now that yeast was mentioned in the forum thread, supposedly from the original brewer, saying that the Shipyard strain was originally Ringwood, that's been taken over there and obviously maybe mutated a bit and changed over the years in their brewery. But Ringwood is as close as you're going to get to it, essentially, if that is in fact what theirs was based on, because there is no, as far as I know, commercial strain of yeast available that's based on their house yeast. So Ringwood for the yeast, 1046 OG. IBUs were given as I think 42, 43, so I've got those in as I think 41 on mine. I'm not sure why I did it as 41 rather than 2, but maybe that was just what I ended up with when I adjusted the alpha acids on some of the hops. But yeah, 40 plus IBUs anyway. Colour wise, I went for the top of the scale for well, not quite the top of the scale, but towards the top end of the scale for an American amber ale, about 29 EBC in this case, and obviously I then used that to work out what was going into the grist, and yeah, that's pretty much it numbers wise. So 1013 estimated finishing gravity at a mash temperature of 67 would give 4.3% as per the original beer. So grist wise, pale ale malt obviously is the base, Maris Otter in this case, and then the forum thread and the information on the bottle only mentions crystal rye malt, so I've just used crystal rye malt. It's a very prominent flavour in the beer, so I'm pretty certain that there's got to be at least 10% crystal rye, and maybe more, so I've gone with 11.5% of that, or 450 grams, a pound basically for our American friends, of the crystal rye. And the forum thread also mentioned just a little bit of chocolate malt, which I assumed must just be there really for colour adjustment, so I've put in just enough of that to bring the colour up from where it was to the 28, 29 EBC value that I mentioned before. So that worked out to 60 grams of chocolate malt. So that was the grist, fairly simple, just pale ale malt, crystal rye and chocolate. Then hopping wise, I did have to make a couple of substitutions here, so it's supposed to be Summit, Cascade, Amarillo and Citra. Don't have any Summit, so I used Columbus instead. Put that in as a bittering hop. 9 grams at the start of the boil. From the flavour of the beer that I tasted, I think there's a lot of the rest of it is probably mainly late additions, so I put in some Cascade towards the end of the boil with the other hops, so 14 grams of Cascade and Columbus at 10 minutes, just to bring the total bittering up really more than anything else, and give you a little bit of that extra flavour from those mid-boil additions. Then a Whirlpool edition of the Amarillo, Cascade and Citra, 16 grams of each. And then for the dry hop, as stated on the bottle on the website, just Amarillo and Citra for the dry hop, so 30 grams of each of those. It does have good hop flavour to it, that beer, but it's not massively pungent as far as I'm concerned, so I figured about 60 grams total dry hop felt like about the right amount for me. So hopping wise, that's really just sort of total guesswork, to be honest. based on the sort of level of hoppiness that I perceive in the beer and how I would try and achieve that from what I know from my own experience. But you know, those are all nice hops, so I'm sure it will taste nice whether or not it's that close to the original or not. And like I said, I've already subbed one of the hops out, so there's probably a good chance that it's going to be quite a different kind of hop profile anyway. Yeah, so that's it. That's basically the recipe. Let's do some brew footage. Right, so we're a few months after I actually brewed that beer now. I was intending to obviously do a side-by-side at the end of this video. Unfortunately, the fuck knuckles at Morrison's, or at least the local one to me, decided to discontinue sales of that particular beer. I haven't been able to find it anywhere else locally, and they don't seem to be selling it in the local Wetherspoons either, so I couldn't get hold of the original Shipyard Rye Pale Ale anywhere. So yeah, basically I'm just going to have to drink the version I've got and try and remember what the original was like. Now obviously this is, I guess, the final part of the process in terms of trying to zero in your clone recipe, comparing it to the original, trying to adjust based on where you perceive any differences to be, and so on. I probably won't be, you know, going back to rebrew this with the intention of trying to get it closer to that beer, although I will kind of point out where I think the differences are now anyway. I was quite happy with how it came out. I nearly didn't end up doing this, finishing off this video at all, because after looking around to try and find the original beer for a while, the keg kicked, and yeah, I thought I was all out of the beer. But I remembered I did have a couple of bottles that I'd taken off the keg for beer mail, so I will use one of those today. And yeah, it's a little bit older than I would have liked ideally for doing the taste test, but it should be okay. As I said, I was quite pleased with how it came out anyway. I did send a couple of these out. Matthew Calaby, Brewboy Calaby, was good enough to do a quick review on it, and he seemed to like it because he asked for the recipe and has just brewed a version himself. So I think that's always a good endorsement of one of your beers, when somebody else is willing to actually have a go at brewing it for themselves. So whoops, chucked a few little floaters in from that. So even though it was off the keg, this beer did pick up a few little bits of yeast towards the end. The ringwood yeast does seem to, although it's very flocculent, kind of have a few little floaters in it if you're not careful, so be aware of that. Otherwise though, good clarity. It's very dark, so it's quite difficult to see. I think the colour is pretty close to what I was looking for compared to the original. It's got a nice aroma, good mix of kind of sweet, rich maltiness as you'd want in an amber ale, and a bit of the hop there as well. So again, not necessarily, I wouldn't describe it as a tropical kind of hoppiness, but there's a little bit of citrus there, and just a general nice sort of spicy hoppiness coming off of it. I think that's a little bit of the rye as well, maybe giving you that slight spiciness. Flavour wise, again, the level of hopping is pretty good. I think in the original I probably perceive that to be a little bit more bitter, maybe. But as you saw with the brew day footage before, this one did come out with a higher gravity, so I got much higher efficiency than I was expecting for some reason on this brew. The yeast also attenuated higher than I expected, so it had quite a big difference in ABV to what I was expecting. So I was aiming for 4.3, I think. This ended up at 5.1, so I think there is a difference in terms of the sort of body and kind of sweetness of it. Not in a bad way, I actually quite like that, but I think the original is a little bit drier, maybe lighter in body. So first of all, trying to get those target numbers would probably have helped to get it closer to the original, although to be honest I think I'd probably prefer it this way with a little bit more chewiness to it, and that may also obviously have an effect on the perceived bitterness as well, because it alters the bitterness to gravity ratio. As far as the hopping goes, I think I'm in the ballpark. The hops were not exactly the same as what would have gone into the original, and the schedule was kind of made up off the top of my head, so I wasn't expecting it to be particularly you know, identical in that sense, but I think it's along the same lines, so quite happy with that. And grain bill, I think, again, colour wise I think it's pretty close to what I wanted, and flavour wise it's definitely along the same lines, but like I said, just with a little bit more body to it, and yeah, more of that malty kind of chewiness to it. So it's a good beer. I really liked it, as you can probably tell by the keg having disappeared. Like I said, there will be quite a few tweaks that I'd make to that if I was going to rebrew it with the intention of trying to get it closer to the original. So again, it's, you know, if you are trying to hone in on a really good clone recipe, it's about going back, evaluating the beer and trying to tweak the technique. So with this one, like I said, trying to hit the numbers first of all would probably be one of the main things. I may also consider doing something like lowering the mash temp to try and dry it out a little bit. Other than that, pretty sure the hops could be adjusted slightly. I'm not sure exactly how I would change those to make it close to the original, but I mean, for a start, getting the hops that are supposedly in the original recipe rather than the one that I subbed in would be a good starting point, I suppose. I think, was it cluster or something like that was in it? But yeah, not bad. I think it was reasonably close. So that was my attempt at a clone recipe. And if you're trying to do your own clone sort of off your own back rather than following a recipe, I hope that that video might help you out a little bit. So cheers everyone.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know, that or his dudeness or duder or you know, El Duderino.